My name is Felisa Tibbetts, and I have been working actually with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for a very, very long time, beginning with when I was directing a civil society organization that I co-founded, Human Rights Education Associates, which already tells you something about what my focus is, which is human rights education and training. And I have, in the last 8 years, migrated into higher education primarily, where I am now working in the formal education sector, again focused on human rights education and training. So my work is what I call a kind of a subsection, if you will, of the wider international human rights movement, with a focus on education and training as a tool for preventing human rights violations and also promoting human rights. So I have over my career worked in the non-formal education sector and online learning, and now I am a chair in human rights education at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. I also teach a course in human rights at Columbia University for undergraduates, and I have really just had a pleasure to work in this field for many, many years now. Why am I in Lund? I'm very glad to say I had an invitation from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute to come here to be part of a workshop that's taking place in conjunction with RWI's work in clinical legal education. So many, many years ago when the Berlin Wall first came down, so we're talking about the 1990s, it was an era of reform in law schools. And I, at that time, worked a bit with the Open Society Institute, not as a lawyer, because my background is in political science and education. I have been learning human rights through my human rights lawyer friends and colleagues for many years now. But anyway, when law schools were reforming following the opening up of those countries in Central Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, clinical legal education was introduced, and I was brought in as somebody who was very familiar with methodologies of instruction, because again, I've worked a bit in education in the schooling sector, and so I could help with bringing more participatory and experiential techniques into law schools that were interested to move into offering clinics for their students. And so the Raoul Wallenberg Institute has been involved in clinical legal education itself for many years now. I think many of the regional offices of RWI are collaborating with essentially Lund University, but collaborating with universities in these other countries. And at some point, I was invited in to work with RWI on this, and I've been very happily collaborating in China, in Turkey in the past, and now here in Lund itself. So it's great to be here. Clinical legal education, yes, I guess you have to sort of know what it, you have to be in the field to really know what that is. So it's clinic in the sense that it has to do with giving law students a genuine experience in practicing law of some form. So instead of only being in a classroom and doing projects, let's say, or papers related to traditional kind of learning in the classroom and in law schools, clinics put students into situations where they are either, say, working with live clients, providing information, or doing research on cases. It depends on the status of the law school and in that country to what degree and how law students can themselves become involved in those legal processes, but they can certainly do kind of research. But they're working with live clients, developing techniques like interviewing, intake procedures, legal research, doing analysis for how cases might be presented in the national courts, for example, or just generally giving information about people's rights. The kind of clinic I have been involved with more in the past is something called the street law type clinic, which is not just putting law school students in contact with live clients in some way, but actually having law school students educate members of the public, for example, secondary school students or people who are incarcerated about their rights. Street law meaning everyday knowledge about rights that people can use in their daily lives. So clinical legal education, clinic means it's alive. It's a live experience, and it's been, for those, I think, law school students who participate in clinical training, it's a phenomenal experience because it gives them an opportunity to really develop a number of different kinds of skills that they can use in the future as lawyers. And the human rights clinics, sometimes they're called human rights clinics, other times, depending on the country, they may not be called a human rights clinic, but the kind of work they do is aligned with human rights values, like working with vulnerable populations. Human rights clinics have also been very instrumental in promoting with law school students a kind of sense of social responsibility and contact with populations that they may want to in the future work with, either as lawyers or working in civil society organizations. There's so many different ways to do human rights work, but human rights clinics are, I think, really important for the international human rights movement. Well, human rights and clinical legal education, there's different kinds of connections. I began in a way to already allude to it. One way that clinical legal education and human rights are connected is because of what law school students who are working in clinics can offer to people who may be suffering from human rights violations. Typically, the clients coming to clinics don't have the material resources to afford legal representation. So already law school students may be working with vulnerable populations just due to their economic level. That condition of poverty or low income resources can intersect with other kinds of vulnerabilities, like being a member of a minority population. It could be an ethnic minority, or being a person with disabilities, that sort of intersectionality. So already law school clinics, especially those who are focused on vulnerable populations, may be working to not only help deliver right to a fair trial, let's say, or but educating about their rights as part of their work, their association, that is the clients with the clinics. So as you might imagine, just with that example, clinics, especially again human rights clinics, are helping to, if you will, deliver rights to populations that are vulnerable in various societies. They're also educating them about their rights, not only just legal information, but maybe rights that they might have because of their, their membership in in a group like women's or persons with disabilities who have special protections afforded to them through international or regional human rights standards. So that's a very clear connection with human rights with the clinics. The clinics also are I think connected with human rights, and maybe this is obvious, but the experience of the law school students themselves engaging with these populations, thinking about how international human rights standards apply to real problems people are facing in everyday life in their country, is a really powerful lesson in human rights. So it's a very mutually beneficial, I would say, between what the law school students learn through that experience working with clients and what the clients get from working with the clinics in terms of the human rights, the virtuous cycle of human rights of, if you will, duty bearers. In this case, maybe you can see the law school students in a way helping to fulfill obligations of the state to respect, protect, and promote human rights. And on the other hand, the clients who can be seen in this context as rights holders. This particular workshop is focusing on dimensions of the human rights-based approach to clinical legal education. And that is actually something I'm working specifically with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute on now. I have for many years wanted to work closely with RWI in thinking consciously about the rights-based approach to their programming, meaning not just working with law schools as important as that work is in supporting their teaching and learning processes related to human rights, not only doing that, but taking a kind of a wider perspective, a holistic perspective on how human rights values and standards can relate to the work of law schools, universities in general. The rights-based approach, for example, in a clinical legal program would suggest that there should be explicit reference to international and regional human rights standards in the clinical work. Again, especially for human rights clinics, where if they're called human rights clinics, they're probably doing that. But let's say it's a refugee clinic, they could still make references to the relevant human rights standards, the treaties that is. So the human rights-based approach says whenever possible, conditions allowing, because there are conditions in societies where human rights puts people in danger if they're calling it as such. So, but when you can, make those references explicit. And there are also a number of cross-cutting values related to human rights, such as non-discrimination, participation, transparency, accountability, ways of working in clinics, law schools, universities that can also be illuminated by thinking about the rights-based approach. So I'm happily working with RWI more broadly on a kind of handbook for the rights-based approach in higher education. And as part of the clinical legal education program, we're also looking at that in relation to the work of the clinics. So today, for example, earlier today, I presented a piece of work related to that handbook, which we're, for now, calling the Human Rights-Based Approach checklist for clinics. So, so the checklist for the Human Rights-Based Approach is just a kind of prompt for faculty members and their students and other stakeholders to reflect on the different ways in which their clinics already do and might reflect a human rights-based approach. And the different segments include, for example, how aware faculty, students, and partners are about the human rights-based approach and consciousness about their human rights role, if you will. So it's that awareness of the approach. It also has other elements, for example, to what degree the programming that is developed in the clinic is driven by the client needs, and it's highly participatory. If there is also accountability in the sense that they get feedback, the clinic gets feedback from clients about how well they're doing their work, or their partners if they're working with a civil society organization, and also vice versa. And another feature, just as an example of the rights-based approach, might also be to what degree the faculty themselves with the clinic, or the students, or the partners reflect the diversity that they're seeking to, that not only reflects society, but in particular the diversity of vulnerability that may be related to populations that the clinic is working with, or problems in society. So the program I'm working on with them now on in terms of the clinics has to do with the rights-based approach and this kind of checklist, but it's a piece of this bigger frame of work with the rights-based approach in higher education. So with the rights-based approach, especially with the clinics that are represented here at the workshop that's happening today and tomorrow, I think a fair question is, well, what more can we do? Because these are already teams that are very involved and successfully involved in clinical legal education, working with vulnerable populations. Poland has a very highly developed network of basically legal clinics, and they have for decades now been working with populations like homeless populations or people who are incarcerated. Phenomenal work in Poland in the past. And also we have, in Sweden, we have really good clinics as well. Anna Bruce, who is affiliated with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, is at the workshop today, tomorrow. And then we also have representatives from Belarus. For the most part, these are faculty members who in the past successfully worked in Belarus and now unfortunately are not able to work in Belarus directly, so they may be speaking about their previous experiences or the work they're doing in their newly adopted countries. But nevertheless, these are very, very highly experienced law professors. So the people that have come to this workshop already know a lot about human rights, sometimes through their personal experience and their own struggles in their countries. So what's a challenge about this checklist, if you will, I think it's a good challenge, is no matter where you are, how you can push it further and to do even more, because human rights is a field that's full of aspirations and ideals. And so I think it's helpful, and I speak for myself as well, to periodically step back and ask myself, what more can I do? So if we look at the values like participation, accountability, non-discrimination, and so forth, it's helpful, I think, to reflect on what we're doing and what more we might be able to do. And we're looking within the rights framework at this particular workshop. We're kind of taking a deeper look at two dimensions of the rights-based approach. Today, what we're looking at is participation. In what ways are we already engaging our clients or civil society organizations from the law school perspective in determining what kinds of cases we take up, for example. So how participatory is it really? Is it really a true collaboration? Are we really letting the clients and the civil society organizations take the lead in providing services to them versus meeting the needs of the law schools? I'm speaking generally, but so we've thought critically about participation and also thinking about the distinction between a kind of tokenistic involvement of, just in general, of persons with privilege and power with those with less versus a kind of a participation or a process that tries to level out the power so that, and this is very true also in a classroom situation, so even between the faculty members and students, which moves us to more like learner-centered kinds of learning. But anyway, today was participation, and tomorrow we're going to focus on pedagogy or methodologies as a way of promoting action and, transformation. Transformation is kind of a jargon term, but essentially human rights is about change. It's about social change. It's about not only legal change, but cultural change. So when we think about clinical legal education, the residue we want to leave with the law school students, with the clients, and even the faculty members are some kinds of dispositions or skill sets to continue to do the work that we would identify as being human rights related. So how can we be sure that the students have not only a positive experience as, offering advice in legal clinics, but continue to be devoted to this idea that that their work should be promoted, should be related to promoting human rights over the long run. So tomorrow we're going to look at pedagogy and ways in which law school clinics can not only be experiential and give skill sets to law school students, but really encourage them to dedicate their lives to human rights work.